The dream had finally come true for Malik Patterson. A stunning two-story brick home in Brentwood Estates, Tennessee, with a wraparound porch and a sprawling backyard. The kind of place he'd pictured during years of grinding to own property in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. But the moment he pulled into the driveway, moving boxes still stacked high, something felt off. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, their stares lingering too long as they walked their dogs, offering no hellos, no warm welcomes, just a chilling silence. Malik brushed it aside at first. Maybe they were just reserved, maybe they'd come around. But the next morning shattered that hope with a sharp knock on his door. He opened it to find Barbara Whitman, mid-60s, impeccably dressed in a beige blouse and pearl earrings. An HOA pin gleaming on her cardigan, her posture stiff and her eyes carrying an edge he couldn't pin down. "Good morning," she said, her voice clipped. "I'm Barbara Whitman, president of the Brentwood Estates Homeowners Association." Malik offered a handshake and a smile. "Nice to meet you, I know who you are," she cut in, peering past him into the house before thrusting a thick stack of HOA guidelines into his hands. He skimmed the pages, lawn care, paint rules, mailbox designs, standard stuff, until Barbara cleared her throat. "We maintain a certain standard here," she said, her gaze settling on the moving truck still in his driveway. "I assume that'll be gone by evening." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Once I'm unpacked, sure." She nodded, but it wasn't approval, more like she was cataloging a fault. "And trash bins go out no earlier than 6 a.m. on collection day. I noticed yours were out last night." "I didn't put them out," Malik replied evenly. "The previous owners must have." Her lips pursed. "In the future, be mindful. We have rules for a reason." Then she turned and left, leaving Malik exhaling slowly, chalking her up as just another fussy HOA type. Annoying, but not worth losing sleep over. That illusion didn't last. The next few days brought a barrage of warnings. An unauthorized vehicle notice for his own car, a complaint about his lawn being an inch too long, a violation for a porch light, identical to the previous owners, that Barbara deemed too bright. By week's end, he had a stack of her letters, her presence a ghost hovering over his fresh start, though they hadn't spoken since that first meeting. He stayed calm. Maybe she was this nitpicky with everyone, maybe compliance would make her ease up. But that hope died on an evening walk when he passed a group of neighbors chatting in a driveway. They fell silent as he approached, one woman forcing a tight smile while the rest ignored him, and there at the center stood Barbara, arms crossed, whispering something he didn't need to hear to understand. This wasn't about rules, it was about him. If she thought she could scare him off, though, she was dead wrong. The letters kept coming, each morning a new notice in his mailbox, stamped with the Brentwood Estates HOA seal. Petty gripes like trash bins not retrieved fast enough, piling up until Malik hit his limit with the 5th in 2 weeks. This one nagged about bins needing to be back within an hour of collection to preserve aesthetics. He'd grabbed them after work, same as everyone else, but apparently that wasn't enough for Barbara. Curious, he tested her game, strolling the neighborhood at 9 a.m. the next day. Trash bins littered curbs, some overflowing, none tagged with notices except his. He snapped photos and emailed the board asking why he was singled out. No reply came, but 2 days later, Barbara stood on his doorstep again, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, not even bothering to knock. Malik leaned against the frame. "Something I can help you with." She didn't answer, just scanned his house like she owned it, then held up a form. "This is a formal request for proof of home ownership. We've had complaints." His stomach tightened, but he kept his cool. Barbara was about to find out he wasn't the pushover she'd pegged him for. Malik's pulse quickened as Barbara stood there, clipboard poised like a weapon, her voice dripping with a syrupy edge. "Neighbors have expressed concerns, unusual activity, different cars, furniture deliveries at odd hours. Some worry you're renting this property, violating HOA regulations." He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You're kidding." Her face didn't twitch. Taking a deep breath, he kept his tone steady. "First, I own this house. Second, I've been here less than a month. I'm still moving in, hence the deliveries, the cars, friends and family visiting." Barbara's fingers tightened around her clipboard. "We have policies to ensure homeowners are properly vetted. We'll need to verify your deed." Malik's jaw tightened. He knew she wasn't asking this of anyone else, just him. "You can pull the records yourself. It's public," he said evenly. Her eyes narrowed, but she smoothed her expression. "I'd prefer you submit it directly." He tilted his head. "And if I do—" Her lips curled into a cold, empty smile. Then I'll have no choice but to escalate this with the board. He exhaled slowly, biting back the words itching to spill out. She wanted him to snap to give her ammunition, but he wouldn't play that game. "I'll think about it," he said, shutting the door before she could respond. She didn't like that. Hours later, as he sipped a beer on his porch, he spotted her at the end of his driveway, whispering to a man in a polo shirt and khakis, who nodded and jotted notes. Malik didn't need to guess what was brewing. Barbara wasn't just needling him anymore, she was gunning to get him out. The next morning proved it. An email from the HOA, subject notice of violation, claimed his porch furniture, 2 wicker chairs, and a glass table didn't meet aesthetic standards. He'd seen worse setups on a dozen porches, some with faded plastic relics from decades past, yet his was the problem. Ignoring it brought a second notice the next day. Lawn maintenance violation, despite his grass being freshly cut and hedges trimmed to perfection. Malik leaned back, irritation simmering. He knew Barbara was stacking complaints, drowning him in petty infractions to build a case. So he flipped the script. That evening he walked the neighborhood, noting every violation he'd been fined for elsewhere. Overgrown yards, broken shutters, trash bins still curbside from morning. With time-stamped photos, he filed his own complaints with the HOA. Less than a day later, Barbara was back, this time with Stephen Reynolds, the vice president, a clipboard-toting older man with salt-and-pepper hair. Her politeness was strained thin. "Mr. Patterson, we received your list of complaints." Malik crossed his arms. "Good, then you know I'm not the only one held to a ridiculous standard." Stephen coughed, glancing at Barbara. "We appreciate your concerns, but the board decides which issues warrant action. Not every infraction gets a notice." Malik scoffed. "So mine do, but no one else." Barbara didn't reply, handing him a form instead. "This is your final warning before fines. Replace the porch furniture and keep your lawn at regulated length." He stared at the paper, then met her gaze. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about making him feel unwelcome. Smiling slowly, he pushed back. "I've read the bylaws, Barbara. Nowhere does it say I have to replace perfectly good furniture." She stiffened, jaw twitching. "It's about uniformity." He raised an eyebrow. "So you enforce rules that don't exist?" Stephen shifted, doubt flickering in his eyes. Malik seized it. "If I were someone else, say a neighbor, would we be having this conversation?" Barbara's nostrils flared. Stephen hesitated, silent. "That's what I thought," Malik said, folding the form. She inhaled sharply, forcing a tight smile. "If you refuse to comply, the HOA can take further action." He met her stare, unflinching. "Then do what you have to do." She stormed off, Stephen trailing behind, and Malik gripped the notice, knowing he'd called her bluff. But Barbara wasn't one to fold easily, and he braced for her next move. Malik knew Barbara wouldn't let his defiance slide, but he didn't expect her to escalate so fast. The next morning, a thick envelope waited in his mailbox. No HOA logo this time, just the stark letterhead of a law firm. Inside, an official complaint filed with the Davidson County Housing Authority accused him of being a fraudulent occupant, claiming he'd failed to prove ownership, might be renting under false pretenses, and that multiple neighbors had concerns about his presence. No names, no evidence, just vague accusations wrapped in legal fluff. His pulse stayed steady, but his grip tightened on the paper. She jumped from petty fines to trying to legally oust him from his own home. For a moment he considered letting it blow over. The claims were flimsy, unlikely to stick. Then it clicked. This wasn't about winning an eviction. It was about wearing him down, burying him in stress until he'd rather leave than fight. She'd miscalculated, though Malik wasn't the type to buckle. That evening he dialed Joe Martinez, his real estate attorney, a sharp, relentless bulldog who'd navigated worse than this. "Hey, Joe, I need a favor," Malik said, voice calm but firm. By morning, Joe had armed him with everything he needed, not just to defend himself, but to turn Barbara's game upside down. 3 days later, the HOA emergency meeting buzzed with tension, the room packed with homeowners craning to see the showdown they'd heard whispered about. Barbara sat at the head of the table, her face a mask of neutrality, flanked by board members fidgeting with notes. She lifted a document, voice clipped. "We're here to address the ongoing issue with Mr. Patterson's residence, numerous violations and community concerns." Malik cut in, calm but unwavering. "I'd like to speak." Her lips thinned. "You'll respond after." "No," he said, setting down his own stack of papers. "I'm speaking now." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Barbara stiffened but waved him on. He stood unfolding his first document. This is the deed to my house, filed, recorded, indisputable proof I own it. Heads turned, board members exchanged glances. He set it down, pulling another. This is the purchase agreement for 24 Oakwood Drive. Barbara's expression barely shifted, but confusion flickered in her eyes. Then he held up the final paper, letting the words hang. And this is the deed for 26 Oakwood Drive, Barbara's house. The room went dead silent. Her mouth parted slightly, no sound escaping as Malik let the bombshell settle. She'd spent weeks trying to evict him, oblivious that he'd bought her foreclosed home out from under her. You might want to check the HOA records, Barbara, he said, folding his arms. That foreclosure you ignored, the sale last month, I was the buyer. Gasps punctured the stillness. Her hands clenched her papers, knuckles whitening. So tell me, he added, voice steady, who's the real trespasser now? The air shifted, Barbara's face drained of color, her composure cracking as the crowd processed the twist. She built her crusade on control, thinking she could bend Malik to her will, but he'd flipped the table, exposing her vulnerability in front of everyone. He wasn't done, though. He picked up another document, tapping it lightly. Now let's talk about fraudulent eviction attempts. Her head snapped up. Excuse me, he held up her legal complaint. You reported me as an illegal occupant, claimed I had no right here. Care to explain why? Her fingers twitched against the table, voice forced even. As I stated, several residents expressed concerns. Who? Malik cut in, her jaw tightened. I'm not at liberty to disclose. No names, he pressed, eyebrow raised. Funny, I talked to neighbors before this meeting. No one recalls expressing concerns. Murmurs grew louder, eyes darted around the room. Barbara was losing her grip, and Malik was just getting started. She'd walked into her own nightmare, and he was about to make it worse. The room's tension thickened as Malik's words hung in the air, Barbara's authority unraveling with every eye now questioning her. She scrambled to regain footing, but he didn't give her the chance. You accused me of violating HOA policy, he said, pulling out a stack of printed emails. Yet you've ignored other violations in this community. He turned to the board. I filed complaints, broken shutters, overgrown lawns, trash bins out for days. None got notices. Tell me, do these rules only apply when Barbara feels like enforcing them? Stephen Reynolds, the vice president, cleared his throat uneasy. I think we should take a moment to... No, Malik snapped, eyes locked on Barbara. This isn't about HOA rules, it never was. It's about her deciding who belongs here. A sharp murmur swept through the crowd. Barbara's lips parted, panic flashing across her face for the first time. She wasn't just exposed, she was cornered. She let out a shaky breath. Mr. Patterson, I was simply trying to intimidate me into leaving, he finished, voice cutting through hers. Yeah, I got that. Silence fell, then a voice pierced it from the back. This is a disgrace, muttered Mr. Holloway, a grizzled longtime resident, shaking his head. You really tried to evict the man who owns your house. Scattered chuckles broke out, the mood shifting. Malik wasn't just winning, he was rewriting the narrative. He placed his final document on the table. One more thing, Barbara, you're behind on your HOA fees. Her head jerked up. That's a lie, he tapped the paper. I bought your house at auction, remember. That includes the debt, over $3,000 in unpaid fines and fees. Whispers erupted. Stephen adjusted his glasses, frowning as he scanned the document. Barbara, is this true? Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She was sinking, and everyone saw it. Malik leaned back, calm but unrelenting. I suggest you start paying up. Wouldn't want to violate your own rules, would you? Laughter rippled through the crowd, even some board members stifling grins. Barbara's face burned red. She'd spent weeks wielding her power like a club, only to have it shatter in her hands. Desperate, she clutched her papers. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped, shoving them into a folder. We'll revisit this later. She bolted for the exit, heels clicking furiously, but no one followed. Her command was gone. Malik exhaled, tension easing from his shoulders. He'd won this round, but he knew Barbara's pride wouldn't let her slink away quietly. The murmurs grew as she vanished, neighbors whispering, "Can you believe this?" And she tried to evict the wrong guy. Stephen, still at the table, fumbled with his tie. Well, I think it's safe to say this was mishandled. Mishandled? Malik let out a dry laugh. Lisa Hendrick, a neighbor from down the street, turned to him, sheepish. I don't know what to say. I had no idea she was doing this. He arched an eyebrow. Didn't you? She faltered, and others looked away. They'd known, watched Barbara target him, stayed silent until her fall made it safe to care. Malik didn't linger on their guilt. He faced Stephen instead. Since we're here, let's discuss actual HOA violations. He slid his list across the table, the one Barbara had buried. Broken fences, trash bins, unmowed lawns, all ignored while I got fined. Stephen glanced at it, then the board, some shifting uncomfortably. We'll review these properly, he said. Malik nodded. Good, and I'd like to file a formal complaint against Barbara Whitman for harassment, falsifying complaints, and misusing her authority. The room buzzed again. Lisa shifted. Do we have the authority for that? Stephen sighed. The board can vote to remove an officer abusing their position. Malik leaned forward. Then put it to a vote. Hands rose slowly, one by one. Barbara's reign was crumbling, and she wasn't even there to see it fall. The vote moved fast. Lisa nodded, seconded, and hands lifted around the room, a quiet rebellion against the woman who'd ruled them with an iron grip. Malik watched as neighbors who'd once cowered under Barbara's glare now stripped her of her title, the irony thick. If she'd left him alone, she'd still be perched at the head of that table. Stephen cleared his throat, voice steady but strained. By majority vote, Barbara Whitman is officially removed as president of the Brentwood Estates HOA, effective immediately. The words landed like a gavel, final and sharp, sealing her fate. Malik stood, slipping his papers into his folder with a calm, well, that was productive. A few chuckles broke the tension as he stepped out, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes, some guilty, some awed, tracking him. They'd all learned something tonight, but Barbara, the one who needed it most, was still blind to her own ruin. She didn't waste time proving it. The next morning, Malik spotted her at the edge of his driveway, her husband, Richard, a stiff, scowling man in his early 70s, beside her. He stepped onto his porch, arms crossed. "Something I can help you with?" Barbara's voice was tight, barely holding its composure. "I want to discuss the sale of my home." He'd expected this. Renting from him must have been a dagger to her pride. "I'm not selling," he said simply, her jaw clenched. "I've lived there 32 years. He tilted his head. "And yet you never paid off the debt attached to it." Richard coughed, stepping in. "We're prepared to offer a fair price." Malik leaned against the railing. "Define fair," Barbara huffed, patience fraying. "The amount you paid at auction." He laughed, short and sharp. "That's not how real estate works. You lost it to unpaid fees. I bought it legally. If you want it back, it's market value." Her fists balled up. "That's ridiculous. You're just profiting off me." His expression hardened. "No, Barbara, I'm treating you how you treated me." Silence stretched, heavy and bitter. She'd hounded him for weeks, thinking she held the whip, and now she was the one begging. Richard sighed, rubbing his face. "How much?" Malik glanced at the house. "Given the location, market rates, and your unpaid fees, $450,000. Barbara's face twisted. "That's outrageous," he shrugged. "Then find somewhere else to live." Panic flickered in her eyes. This wasn't just losing power, it was losing her anchor, 3 decades of her life slipping away. Richard exhaled heavily. "We'll consider it." Malik nodded. "Take your time." As they turned to leave, Barbara hesitated, looking back with something new in her gaze, not quite regret, but a dawning realization she'd never been the puppet master she'd imagined. Malik let her stew in it, then spoke. "Barbara," she turned stiffly. "Next time you judge someone before knowing them," he gestured to her house, "remember where it got you?" She said nothing, just walked off, the weight of her missteps dragging behind her. A month later, a for sale sign stabbed the lawn at 26 Oakwood Drive. Barbara refused his price, and no bank would loan her the cash. She and Richard packed up under cover of night, slinking to a smaller place across town. The neighborhood shifted without her. The HOA started functioning, tackling real issues instead of petty vendettas. Some neighbors still avoided Malik's gaze, ashamed of their silence, but others warmed up. One day, Lisa Hendrick trudged up his driveway with a plate of cookies. "I know it's late," she said, awkward, "but welcome to the neighborhood." He smiled, taking the plate. "Took you long enough," she chuckled, sheepish. "Yeah, it did." He bit into a cookie, sweet, a bit stale, but a start. Barbara's exit didn't erase the past, but it cracked the wall she'd built, and Malik stood firm on the other side, unshaken. Barbara's midnight escape didn't erase her mark overnight, but it loosened the stranglehold she'd had on Brentwood Estates, leaving the neighborhood to figure out what came next. The HOA, under Stephen's interim lead, pivoted hard. Meetings shifted from Barbara's nitpicking crusades to practical fixes, repairing cracked sidewalks, addressing overgrown trees, even starting a community garden nobody would have dared propose under her watch. Malik noticed the change on his walks. Trash bins lingered without fines, porches sported mismatched chairs, and kids played louder, their laughter echoing where silence once reigned. It wasn't perfect. Some neighbors still dodged his eyes, their guilt a quiet shadow, but others nodded now, a few even stopping to chat about the weather or the latest HOA vote. The wall Barbara had fortified was crumbling brick by petty brick. Malik didn't gloat, though the irony wasn't lost on him. He'd bought her house almost by accident, a fluke born from her own neglect, and it had become the lever that toppled her throne. He'd listed 26 Oakwood Drive after she balked at his price, and it sold fast. A young couple snatched it up, painting it a bold yellow that would have sent Barbara into a tailspin. The sale netted him a tidy profit, enough to upgrade his own place. New porch furniture wicker just to tweak her memory, a sprinkler system for his unregulated lawn, and a security camera that caught every nosy glance. He didn't need the money, it was the principle, a quiet jab at the woman who'd tried to drown him in fines for less. The HOA notices stopped coming, his mailbox empty of her stamped venom, and for the first time since moving in, he felt the peace he'd chased when he signed the deed. That peace got tested, though, when he spotted Richard Whitman at the grocery store a few weeks later, grayer, stooped, pushing a cart with the same stiff posture. Their eyes met across the aisle. Richard froze, then gave a curt nod before wheeling away. Malik didn't follow. Whatever Barbara had told him, it wasn't his burden to unpack. Word trickled back eventually. They downsized to a condo, Barbara railing to anyone who'd listen about unfair treatment. But her audience had shrunk to a handful of loyalists too polite to argue. She'd lost more than her house and title. She'd lost the fear she'd wielded like a scepter, and without it she was just another voice fatting into the noise. Malik couldn't help a small, satisfied grin at that. She'd built her empire on control, only to watch it collapse under her own weight. The neighborhood kept evolving. Lisa's cookies turned into an invite to a block party, a clumsy but genuine olive branch. He went, sipping lemonade among faces that had once stared from behind curtains, now swapping stories of Barbara's reign like it was a shared fever dream. "Remember when she fined me for my dog barking at a squirrel?" one guy laughed. "Or that time she measured my grass with a ruler," another chimed in. Malik stayed quiet, letting them vent. He didn't need to pile on. His victory spoke louder than words. The party stretched into dusk, kids chasing fireflies, and for the first time he felt less like the outsider she'd painted him as. Brentwood Estates wasn't his dream neighborhood yet. Too many scars lingered. But it was home now, a place he'd fought for and won, not just against Barbara, but against the silence that had let her thrive. As he walked back to his porch, the night air cool against his skin, he knew one thing. She'd never take that from him again. Brentwood Estates settled into a new rhythm without Barbara's shadow looming over every curb and mailbox. A quieter, messier normal that Malik hadn't dared hope for when he'd first unpacked his boxes. The HOA, now steered by Stephen and a handful of reformed board members, traded petty power trips for practical wins. A new playground went up, fences got fixed, and the annual dues actually funded something visible instead of vanishing into Barbara's vague beautification schemes. Malik's walks showed the shift. Lawns grew shaggy without panic, holiday lights blinked past her deadlines, and neighbors waved more often, their hellos tentative but growing bolder. It wasn't a fairy tale. Some still carried the old chill, their smiles tight with unspoken apologies. But the air felt lighter, like the neighborhood had finally exhaled after holding its breath too long. Malik leaned into it, carving out his own space in the chaos he'd upended. The profit from Barbara's house paid for more than upgrades. It bought him time, letting him sink roots deeper into the life he'd fought for. He built a garden out back, tomatoes and peppers thriving where she'd once seen only violations, and swapped the porch light she'd hated for a brighter one just because he could. The security camera stayed, a silent guard against any lingering ghosts of her reign, though he rarely checked it. Peace had settled in, and he intended to keep it. Word of Barbara trickled back now and then. She'd tried rallying a comeback at a condo association across town, but her old tricks, fines for trivialities, lectures on standards, flopped without the leverage she'd once had. Her name popped up less, her story fatting into a cautionary whisper among the neighbors who'd outlasted her. That fatting didn't mean she'd vanished completely. One crisp morning, Malik found a letter in his mailbox, no HOA stamp, just a plain envelope with her tight, precise handwriting. He opened it on the porch, coffee steaming beside him. A single page, no greeting, just, "You may have one, but this isn't over. I'll be watching." He chuckled, folding it into a drawer with her old notices. Let her watch. She had no power left to wield. It was her last gasp, a petty echo of the woman who'd once stood on his doorstep with a clipboard and a vendetta. He didn't bother replying. Silence was his answer, the same silence she'd forced on others now turned back on her. Later, Lisa mentioned seeing her at a coffee shop, ranting to a bored barista about injustice until the line moved on without her. "She's a relic now," Lisa said, half laughing. Malik nodded. "Good." The block party became a yearly thing, a marker of the neighborhood's shift, less about Barbara's absence and more about what filled it. Malik hosted the next one, his backyard alive with grills and music, kids darting through sprinklers while adults swapped tales of her absurdity. "She fined me for a birdhouse once, said it clashed with the roof," one woman groaned, and the laughter rolled easy. He didn't join in much, content to watch from the porch, the scene a quiet triumph he hadn't planned but couldn't deny. Brentwood wasn't perfect, old tensions lingered in sidelong glances, but it was his, earned through a fight he hadn't picked. As dusk fell, fireflies sparking in the yard, he sipped a beer and thought of Barbara's letter. She could watch all she wanted. This was his home now, her rules buried under the life he'd built. The turkeys, no, the tomatoes, grew fat in the garden, the light burned bright, and the neighborhood kept moving forward, leaving her where she belonged. A footnote in a story they'd all outgrown. Brentwood Estates didn't just recover from Barbara's reign. It redefined itself, shedding her rigid grip for something rower, truer to the people who lived there. The HOA meetings turned into actual discussions. Stephen pushed for a newsletter instead of violation slips, and the garden Malik had started sparked a trend. Backyards blooming with vegetables and wildflowers no rulebook could tame. The annual block party morphed into a full-blown festival, spilling onto the streets with food trucks and live music. Kids painting murals on old fences Barbara would have fined into oblivion. Malik's farm? No, his home, stood at the heart of it, the wraparound porch a perch where he watched the chaos unfold, coffee in hand, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. Neighbors who'd once stared now brought casseroles, their hellos carrying a warmth that had taken root over time, scars of silence fatting into something like trust. He'd never set out to be the guy who rewrote the neighborhood's story, just wanted a place to call his own, free of meddling. But Barbara's war had made him that, and he wore it lightly. The camera still hummed above his door, but the footage went unwatched. Her last letter sat in that drawer, a relic of a fight she'd lost before she'd even sent it. Word of her dwindled. She'd tried stirring trouble at her condo, finding someone for a welcome mat, but got laughed off the board within a month. Richard showed up once more at the hardware store, buying paint with a tired nod. Malik returned. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Barbara's shadow was gone, her threats as empty as the house she'd left behind. The yellow-painted 26 Oakwood Drive housed a family now, their laughter spilling out where her control once ruled, a final twist she'd never stomach. Malik's life settled into the peace he'd chased, a garden that fed him, a porch that welcomed him, a neighborhood that no longer flinched at his presence. Lisa's cookies became a ritual, her visits less awkward, more neighborly. Others followed, swapping tools or stories, the wall Barbara had built crumbling into dust. The festival grew each year, a celebration of what they'd reclaimed, not just from her, but from the fear she'd sown. He'd stand amid it, watching kids chase each other, adults dance to off-key guitars, and feel the weight of his deed in his pocket, not just paper, but proof he belonged. Barbara had seen him as an outsider to expel. Instead, he'd turned her rules against her, flipped her game, and won a home she couldn't touch. As the sun dipped low one festival night, fireflies flickering over his yard, Malik leaned against the railing, the air thick with grill smoke and laughter. She wanted him gone, thought her power, rules, status, intimidation could break him, but real strength wasn't in her clipboard or her fines. It was in knowing who he was, refusing to let her rewrite him into something small. She misjudged him, underestimated a man who'd fought for every inch of this life and paid for it with everything she'd clung to. The garden thrived, the light shone bright, the neighborhood breathed free, her nightmare his victory. He sipped his coffee, the bitterness softened by the sweet hum of a place finally his, and let her fade into the past where she belonged. Brentwood Estates moved on. Louder, messier, better, and Malik stood firm at its center. Not a hero, not a victim, just a man who'd held his ground and turned a house into a home she'd never take away.